Hi, John.
Hi, Shad. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So your book is about digital culture, and it's prompted a lot of reaction online, articles, and conversations. First off, were you surprised by the amount of attention it's received so far?
Yeah, I was. For like 30 years, I've been writing stories about power, I guess, and about, especially when power goes crazy. So, and that goes all the way back to my book, Them, where I was talking about kind of secret cabals like the Bilderberg Group and, their kind of power. And then in the Ministerial Goats, it was like the power of the military, these kind of weird, crazy factions of the military. And then in the Psychopath Test, it was like, Big Pharma and so on. And so with this book, what I noticed was that, power had changed. We were the ones with the power now. Like suddenly everybody was scared of us on social media. And when I say us, I suppose I mean kind of social justice people like me. So it just felt like a completely appropriate, next story for me to write, I suppose, because I follow where power goes. But this one's had way more pushback than my other stories.
In terms of where power is, I find it so interesting how quickly that shifts.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That was exactly why I wanted to write this. And I think the fact that we're not as fast at keeping up with the shifting sands of power is part of the problem. You're right. So with Justine Sacco, it's like, we are punching up. I mean...
what drew you to her story in particular, Justine Sacco?
Okay. I mean, the one thing I disagree with in your introduction is that you said it was an inflammatory racist tweet. And I would say that it wasn't intended to be racist. It was intended to be kind of mocking privilege as opposed to gleefully flaunting privilege. The tweet was, going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding, I'm white. Yeah. So when people... And then she turned off her phone and fell asleep on the plane and was completely oblivious to the fact that while she slept, her life was torn apart. When people started getting her, it was all to do with punching up, right? It was all to do with, here is this woman who is kind of flaunting privilege. Look at her, she works for a powerful media company. We are punching up. We are getting people misusing their privilege. The fact that I think in Justine Sacco's case, none of that really was true is, for a moment, let's put that to one side.
Okay.
But then when, she's plummeting to the ground, right? Because we're saying, let's get this woman fired. And, because we on social media said, let's get her fired, she got fired. So power instantly shifts. The people who like to see themselves as the silenced minority, because that's how a shaming works. It's like the silenced people punching up. Suddenly they were the ones with all the power. It's like, let's get Justine Sacco fired, she's fired. Let's get her reputation destroyed, her reputation's destroyed. She's now on the ground, completely powerless, and we're still kicking and kicking and kicking.
So opinions about that particular tweet aside, about, what it meant, what do you think it draws us to these kinds of pylons?
It's... I think it's a desire to be empathetic, good, kind, ethical people. We surround ourselves with people who feel the same way that we do. Because, what is social media? It's kind of like a kind of mutual approval machine. Everybody like approves each other. And look, there is nothing more, I love them being approved and congratulated by people who follow me on Twitter. And it's why I joined Twitter. It's a powerful, positive feeling. But then what happens is that, we fall in love with showing how kind and ethical we are. And so we start looking around for people who are misusing their privilege that we can take down. But then we fell so much in love with it that we started attacking people who could only be perceived as being misusing their privilege, if you half close your eyes and massively degrade the definitions of privilege and misuse.
You talked about your relationship with Twitter. Now, when you first joined about 7 years ago, you thought that this sort of social media shaming was okay. It was empathetic. You called it a democratization of justice.
Yeah.
What did you mean exactly by that?
And I still do feel that way to an extent. Or I certainly feel that way with some shamings. People who didn't have a voice suddenly had a voice. Like I always had a bit of a voice, right? I mean,
Yeah.
because I'm a journalist and I'm pretty well known and so on. So I always had a bit of a voice. But I suddenly found that people who had no voice at all, people from marginalised communities, suddenly had a voice and were using their voice in really measured and appropriate ways. So if a right-wing columnist wrote a homophobic or racist column, they could be got. And we suddenly realised, we had more power. I say we because I would join in on those power lines, and it felt like, a levelling of the playing field. And I was certainly on the side of the shamers at that stage.
And again, it's so interesting how quickly this change happens, because Twitter, to some people, is still a new phenomenon. Now, you said you joined 7 years ago, and even in just that 7-year time period, you're seeing a shift in the power and abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. People were really shocked. Like, if we got a Daily Mail columnist for a racist comment in a column, our power was real and immediate. Like, advertisers would withdraw their advertising from the Daily Mail. We were ahead of the curve. But then, as I say, we lost our power. And this is what I think the problem is. And I didn't like... In this book, I don't write about social justice shamings because I'm against social justice shamings, because I'm not. I'm for them. I wrote about it because that is where the power is now. And, we are the ones who decide, who gets to be fired and who gets to have their reputation destroyed. And I think the problem is that we've lost our ability to differentiate between serious transgressions and unserious transgressions. We treat Justine Sacco the same way as we treat the NYPD who have a man in a chokehold and squeeze until he's dead. It's like, this on both occasions, this is somebody who is an absolute sickening villain who must be stopped. And we've lost our power, it seems, to be able to differentiate between the different levels of seriousness.
But it's so ironic that these empathetic social justice warriors would be missing that distinction.
Yeah, and I don't quite get...
Why?
Well, actually, I sort of do get why. I think one of the reasons is that it always takes people a while to work out how to use power judiciously. I think that's one reason, and history shows that. And I think another reason is because there's the kind of echo chamber of social media. There's nobody there. There's nobody there to measure it, because you're surrounding yourself. And I've noticed this week with the kind of pushback I've had of this book. There's nobody there to say, oh, you know what, I'm not sure that Justine Sacco is racist, or I'm not sure that she deserved this, or I'm not sure that, and so on. Because if somebody gets in the middle of this, when everybody's approving each other and everybody's firing each other up and the flame is getting hotter and hotter and hotter, if somebody steps in the way of it and says, oh, I'm not sure, our instinct is to just scream them out. And then we frighten dissenters into silence, which is the opposite of democracy. Social media was set up as a democrat, as a new form of democracy, and yet we are behaving in a really undemocratic way.
Now, you also write about Jonah Lehrer in this book. For those of you that don't know, Jonah Lehrer is a young journalist who was caught fabricating quotes in his book, Imagine How Creativity Works, and fabricating Bob Dylan quotes at that, which makes the crime seem that much worse. But before we get to the question of whether the punishment in fact fit the crime, could you give us a sense of how far Lehrer went wrong as far as his journalistic misdeeds?
Sure. Okay, so the thing that got him was... He wrote this book, Imagine How Creativity Works, in which he quotes Bob Dylan. And one of the quotes was Bob Dylan saying that creativity is just a hard thing to describe. It's just the sense that you've got something to say. So back at home, the journalist Michael Moynihan is lying on his sofa. He's a big Dylanologist, and he's reading that. And he thought, when was Bob Dylan ever that helpful to journalists? It's like Bob Dylan was just an asshole to idiots, to journalists. So he got suspicious, and then he saw some other quotes. Like Bob Dylan once said about reading about himself in the newspaper, I'm glad I'm not that. I'm glad I'm not me. But Jonah Lehrer quoted it as, I'm glad I'm not me, I'm glad I'm not that. So Michael emails Jonah, and Jonah makes the kind of completely idiotic mistake of, instead of saying, oh, my God, I'm such an idiot, you're right, You know, I'm going to fix it. He basically said to Michael, no, my Bob Dylan quotes are correct. It's history that's wrong. I mean, that's basically what he said. So digging and digging and digging until it becomes clear. I mean, I love that. This is how my book starts, with this drama between these two men, you know. And suddenly, you know, the inevitable happens, this moment when Jonah knows it's all over. And all the kind of pop neuroscience, wonderkind, preppy, hipster sort of, you know, armour just falls onto the floor, and he's just a young guy going, you know, please, please, please don't publish. And then Michael is like trapped, you know, what do I do? You know, I write in the book, they're like two men in a car with failed brakes just hurtling towards the cliff edge together. Because, you know, what happens if Michael buries the story? Then he's the spineless journalist. So there's terrible, you know, drama. And then Jonah is, you know, Michael does publish and Jonah is fired. And all that, of course, is completely appropriate. I mean, you know, what Jonah did was completely idiotic and broke loads of journalistic rules. But then Jonah had the chance to publicly apologise and at this foundation lunch. And the foundation decided to live stream his apology and erect a giant Twitter screen behind his head.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. So imagine. I mean, I don't think the foundation was being like...
They didn't know that they were creating this meta art piece. Yeah.
No, exactly. They thought they were still believed in the kind of, they naively believed in the sort of, you know, joyous democratization of Twitter. They thought everybody would be measured, but no, nobody was measured. As Jonah is trying to apologize and basically beg for his life. Yeah. And another screen is in his eye line so he can see all the tweets. And the tweets are like, Jonah Lehrer boring us into forgiving him. Jonah Lehrer is just a sociopath. I mean, what a dehumanizing word, sociopath.
And what's your view on the social media reaction to Jonah Lehrer?
I think it was brutal. I think everything that happened up until that point was completely appropriate.
Yeah.
But, you know, my book before this book was called The Psychopath Test, which looks at, you know, the sort of dehumanizing nature of labels. You know, I write about how children as young as 4 are labeled bipolar in America and put on antipsychotic medication because they have temper tantrums. And, you know, one of these kids died. You know, this is what happens when you fall too much in love with labeling. You know, people are, you know, mislabeled psychopaths, you know, because we love nothing more than to declare other people insane. That's one of our favourite hobbies as human beings. And they were doing all of that to Jonah. And imagine if it was like an actual court. Imagine if a murderer was standing in a dock, you know, pleading, like, before you pass sentence, you know, here are my extenuating circumstances. And the jury all sitting there yelling, you know, bored, sociopath. It's like, you know... If we saw that in a courtroom drama, we wouldn't be on the side of the people yelling bored. Yeah, give us the actual power, and that's what we do.
So in your view, can publicly shamed people like Justine Sacco and Jonah Lehrer ever recover?
Well, Justine's doing a lot better. After a year of kind of being out in the wilderness and crushed. And when I met Justine, what I wanted to do most of all in this book, and I sort of touched on this when I told you about the kind of Jonah Michael story, is just bring those feelings of terror and shame.
On both sides.
Yeah, exactly. Just bring it to life. Make the reader feel it. And so when I first met Justine, she was like just crushed. But then slowly over the years, she kind of got better. And now she is. After a year in the wilderness, you know, she's in a new job, and, you know, my book came out, which is much more sympathetic towards her. Jonah's still out in the wilderness, but he does have a book coming out around September. I mean, we'll see whether it wins him any redemption. I mean, the jury's still out on that. It's funny, you know, that one of the reviews of my book, most of the reviews have been like really positive, but one of the reviews basically said, oh, you know what, shaming's no big deal. You know, that's fine. You know, calling names on the internet's fine. It's no big deal. I did something that most people haven't done, which is go around the world meeting the people who have been destroyed.
Yeah.
You know, suicidal thoughts, anxiety, depression, insomnia. You know, I met one woman who just told a joke that came out badly, didn't leave home for a year and a half. You know, the anxiety, read every single negative comment. The anxiety, you know, snaked its way into her brain. You know, it is really not true to say that it's no big deal. It really is a big deal. What you decide to do with that information is up to you. And sometimes, you know, sometimes if it's an appropriate shaming, then the fact that it's such a big deal means that, my God, we have power and it works. But when we're like so scattershot and when we're just destroying everybody because we've just fallen in love with destruction, it is really wrong. It's factually wrong to say it's no big deal. And it's really important Review said that. And I just felt that was really irresponsible.
Do you think it's an extension of the truth in, I want to say, in the real world, in real life, that we're often defined by our worst mistakes? And now online, we're often defined by our worst tweets.
Yeah, and it's bad when we do it in other forms too. I mean, I've been in the mainstream media for 30 years and, there's an incredible pressure, which, believe me, I've succumbed to many, many times to define an interviewee by the worst thing that they ever did. But the fact is, so I've done it, countless times. And the fact is, though, it's not the right thing to do. Because as Monica Lewinsky said in a great TED Talk that came out the week my book came out, such a good line, it really moved me. She said, people forget that I am dimensional and there was a time when I wasn't broken. And we forget that our fellow human beings are dimensional. Sometimes somebody transgresses in a way that's so serious, that they
speaks to their fundamental character.
Yes, exactly. Of course, and then their transgression is revealed and it should follow them around for the rest of their lives. But this has become a sort of play, this idea has become like a plaything for people. Yeah. So people who don't deserve it, people who are truly dimensional, Monica Lewinsky did a hell of a lot in her life other than that one incident, yet it suits people for either prurient or political or money-making reasons to define her that way. And the same thing is happening on Twitter. Google and Twitter love it when something like that happens to Justine Sacco because they make a fortune.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up because as some people have pointed out, these sites like Google and Twitter maybe need to be held accountable because in the case of people like Justine Sacco, for example, it goes beyond your reputation being ruined, losing your job, especially in the cases of women. It's death threats, it's rape threats.
Yeah.
And oftentimes these sites aren't being held accountable. What can we do?
Yeah, I mean, women have it massively worse than men. There's this huge amount of misogyny out there, this vast amount of misogyny. You're right, when a man... When a man gets shamed, it's like, we're going to get you fired. Yeah. When a woman gets shamed, it's like, we're going to get you fired, we're going to get you raped, we're going to get you murdered. Women always have it massively worse than men. One thing we could do, actually, given that we are, we have the power, we should be more judicious, more understanding of nuance and context, more understanding of working out whether somebody deserves to be, publicly shamed and destroyed or not. Because actually what we are is we're like unpaid shaming interns making a fortune for Google and Twitter. I worked out that Google made, I sort of worked with some economists to try and work out how much they made from Justine Sacco's shaming. And it was like between $120,000 and I think $450,000, that one night.
Wow. She
She was Googled 40 times a month until that month when she was Googled 1,220,000 times. So, maybe we should sort of see ourselves as... and the other thing is, it's not social... when it's an inappropriate shaming, it's not social justice. What it is, it's social justice light. It's like pretend social justice. We should stick to real social justice.
But is there anything to holding these companies accountable? I mean, beyond our individual actions on Twitter and on Google, is there something you can do to hold these companies responsible?
I know that Twitter, and there was a very good point made in one review about how, the men that run these companies still have no idea, how to deal with this stuff.
Yeah.
They see themselves still as kind of, I guess they sort of see themselves as libertarians. But I do know that the head of Twitter, talking about trolls, said, this is ridiculous, we have to do something about this. I always think, and which is great that he said that, but I always think that, focusing all the attention on trolls is slightly taking the easy option because, trolls piled into, whenever there's a shaming, trolls pile into them. But it's not just trolls, it's also nice people like us. So it's more complicated than that. In Europe, there's the right to be forgotten ruling where somebody can apply to have their Google search results de-indexed. As a journalist, if they can prove that they don't deserve to be defined by this particular thing. I mean, one thing that's happened, of course, is that the right to be forgotten has become kind of the right to be reminded of that person. It's like the couple who had sex on a train. It's like, oh, I forgot all about them. And so,
that's the upside to this stuff changing so fast, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, as a journalist, I would have been against the right to be forgotten until I went around, the world meeting people sort of unfairly branded with a scarlet letter for kind of nothing, for a bad joke or something. And for those people, I think, a right to be forgotten is appropriate. People are really scared. Like when the European Court passed that rule about the right to be forgotten, people got really scared. It was so undemocratic. Billionaires are going to be able to get their transgressions buried and so on. But I think for certain people, like ordinary people who didn't do much wrong, I think it can be kind of an appropriate response.
One thing I want to touch on before we have to go. You say the only way to survive online and avoid public shaming is to be very bland on social media.
Right.
What do you think it means if people are increasingly self-censoring online?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's contributing to a more scared, conformist, conservative society. I mean, it is, right? I mean, there's so many people who are now afraid to do. And I'm not talking about offensive language. I feel the same way about offensive language as anybody. I'm against it. As any decent person, I'm against it. But people are scared now.
To, like in the case of Justine Sacco, you're saying they're scared to say
anything.
Wait a second.
Yeah.
Literally.
There was this feminist writer called Helen Lewis who reviewed my book in Britain. And she said she was on social media that night and tweeted, I'm not sure that Justine Sacco line was intended to be racist. And she said immediately, loads of people said, well, you're just, a privileged bitch too. And she said to her shame, she stayed silent that night. Social media gave a voice to the voiceless people. So I think it's a kind of sad irony that a way to survive social media now is to go back to being voiceless.
I think that's a great point to end on, Jon. Thank you so much.
Shad, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.